Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Today, analyst and writer Tom Luongo returns to the show to talk about the economic and geopolitical implications of the current hybrid war between the U.S. and Turkey, and also the broader war around it. We discuss the collapse of the Turkish Lira, dollar-denominated debt, how currency wars work, and the inertia of markets and traders. We also delve into the geopolitical lead-up to this crisis, Turkey's role in the Syrian war and a failed coup, both of which led to realignments and new allies that might result in an unusual rescue. Will Turkey employ a Russian formula for surviving sanctions and currency crises? Will it lead to an exit from NATO? Or will the old guard, cold warrior, foreign policy establishment bring a defiant Erdogan back into the fold one more time? Tom is a former research chemist and a current staunch libertarian. His specialty is markets analysis informed by geopolitics. He currently publishes his blog, Gold, Goats, and Guns, along with a monthly investment newsletter. And his work is featured regularly on sites like Zero Hedge, Strategic Culture Foundation, and Investing.com. This interview was recorded on August 14th, 2018. Hi, Tom. Welcome back to the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Joanne. It's good to be back. Thank you.
So let's talk Turkey. I've caught some of your interviews. You're really getting around these days. So you publish in a couple places and interviews in a couple places also. That's great.
It is actually. It's been an interesting month, honestly, and it's been good for business as well. And I think the Sputnik Radio, the mothership yesterday, which was also really interesting, and then which was good because we talked, we talked Turkey's current problems with the lira and the massive capital outflow that's occurring right now. But what's really got me the attention has been my willingness, or always willingness, to step back and think of things from this big strategic level, right? All of this stuff all of these things happen for a reason. They don't happen, randomly, right?
Yeah, and it's not just about a pastor, and
right. It's never about what they tell us it's about. It's always about 95 other things, right? The big thing here is that, and we can see this palpably for the last 3 or 4 months, that the deep state, shadow government, whatever you want to call it, the real power brokers behind the American government are scared to death that Donald Trump is going to pull us out of NATO. And that NATO is absolutely the main mechanism of continued kind of Western oligarchic control. The Atlantic Council is their propaganda wing, as Lee Stranahan likes to put it. They've been actively talking with Facebook about how to limit the discussion of and why we should ban Alex Jones, and why we should ban conservative voices, and why we need to elect Democrats, and all this stuff. And so Turkey is caught in the middle of this because the failure of U.S. Israeli Saudi policy to atomize and destroy Syria and oust Assad has blown back on Turkey. And Turkey was the first one to get off the reservation, as it were, on the Syria policy, because it became very obvious right after the Russians began to intervene in late 2015. And all of the lies about Syria were beginning to be exposed through the pressure created by Russia's early military success, which exposed the lies that ISIS is so strong that the American military can't deal with them and everything. And all of a sudden, the Russians and the Syrians are going through them like nobody's business. And in 3 weeks, double the amount of territory that the Syrian government controlled, and everybody was like, "What?" And during that phase, it became very obvious that President Erdogan of Turkey was going to be left as the scapegoat, and we were going to try and frame him for everything that was bad in Syria.
To be fair, I mean, Turkey and Erdogan, and I guess not just him, previous leaders too, they do want to straddle the East and the West, and they want to benefit from both.
Okay, yeah, that's absolutely true, and in no way do I discount Erdogan's bona fides as a political cockroach, right?
I mean, they're really just they're really just taking advantage of their geographical location too. I mean, it's not like
it's the tremendously important geography of Turkey. It's the only reason that Turkey's in NATO. It's the only reason that anybody considered adding them to the EU. Yada yada yada. But during that phase of, I have to go through the history here to understand why it is that the United States is so angry with Turkey right now, is because it became very obvious right after the shoot down of the Russian Su-24. And right after, and that happened like 3 or 4 days after the Russians started bombing the oil convoys of ISIS oil convoys, taking Syrian oil out of Syria and moving it into Turkey. And then it was exposed that Erdogan's son was the one brokering the deals and all of that stuff. And so it was a perfect setup for then Erdogan to be angry with Putin and shoot down one of his planes, which he didn't do. I'm convinced that that was a false flag setup to get Erdogan and Putin angry with each other and to start a war between the Russians and the Turks, because traditionally they're not friends in any way. I mean, the Russians and the Turks have fought multiple wars. So it makes perfect sense that that would be a setup. And then right after that, I heard multiple reports of Erdogan like having back-channel diplomatic discussions with Assad in early 2016.
right.
And there were the ceasefires, and then all of a sudden, ISIS and Al-Qaeda couldn't leave Idlib and reinforce Aleppo through Turkish territory. That stuff started to, all of those logistical links started to break down. And once that started to happen, it became, to me, I'm thinking about, well, why would this be happening unless Erdogan realized that he was going to be blamed for all of this, for the failure in Syria, because the Russians and the Iranians and the Syrian Arab army were going to win eventually, and Hezbollah as well.
And there were stories at that point in time that, we saw ISIS fighters on a train in Turkey and that
Right.
they moved freely. That was it. That was definitely floating around the Western media at the time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we were setting him up, and because we didn't want to be exposed as the ones that created all this. Okay, fine. Or us, the Saudis, the Iranians, and others, and Turkey as well. And so once that happened, and once the Russians looked to be ascendant in the region, Erdogan started to, as always, like all good Turkish leaders, start to move himself back towards the other direction, away from the U.S. a little bit, because he's going to start hedging his bets. And then in July of 2016, or June of 2016, I think it was July.
July, yeah.
It was the coup. And the coup attempt against Erdogan was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Right. It changed everything.
Changed everything. And at that point, as far as I was concerned, Turkey was off the reservation then. And now it's just a matter of watching this all play itself out, kind of the fallout. Very, very predictably that these things all of the things that we've seen since then would occur. And they have.
And we also, the proxy ground forces, that wasn't working out. Our train and equip programs weren't working. And therefore, the United States and the whole coalition moved to make the Kurdish fighters the primary proxy ground forces. And of course, that's an, irreconcilable difference with Turkey.
Right. And ultimately, so we always knew that, watching it from this side, or watching it from the outsider's perspective, going, okay, well, then the Russians are going to push, as they're going to push the Turks and the Americans into conflict over the Kurds. And that makes sense. And so, at the end of the day, it became very obvious that Erdogan needed to be removed. And remember, Turkey was bearing the brunt of a lot of the dislocation in Syria, a lot of Turkey's current economic problems, their massive current account deficit, their massive, the amount of debt load and whatnot that's now affecting the currency and financial markets, comes from them taking on millions of Syrian refugees, from taking on the military burden of providing logistics and support and everything else. And up to that point, always having the Americans, in effect, always having their back that way by a strongly dollarized economy. And now we're pulling dollar support. Now the Fed is reversing its policy, its 10-year policy of zero-bound interest rates. And it's leaving a lot of people exposed. It's leaving a lot of Turkish corporates exposed to the fact that even before the lira started to break down, go back to late 2017 when the lira was slowly unwinding. That was still destroying the value of a lot of this Turkish corporate debt, because they pay their bills in local currency, but they owe their debt in dollars, because dollars were cheap to borrow at zero bound interest rates, and to borrow in lira would be 6-7% higher than that. So this is the way emerging markets always get into trouble during a Fed easing cycle. And in this case, an extreme Fed easing cycle that went on for years, along with the QE and everything else, where the interest rates at this point were now at the zero bound. And the same thing with the ECB as well. So even if there's not just dollar-denominated Turkish corporate debt that's a problem, there's also euro-denominated Turkish corporate debt that's a problem. Difference there is that the European Central Bank can't raise interest rates without destroying Europe, because their banking is insolvent. So
let me quote you here just to clarify a little bit on the dollar-denominated debt and local currencies. You say, quote, "A falling local currency makes dollar-denominated debt more expensive to pay off." Mm-hmm. And then later on, you say that they're forced to sell aggressively their local currency and buy dollars in the open market. And this is why the Turkish lira is in serious trouble, for example. Just, for people who may not be up, I'm certainly not any expert on currency exchanges and various currency denominated debt. I just want to inject that there.
It's really important to understand that Turkey's problems don't come from having a high sovereign debt to GDP ratio. It's only 28%. The Turkish government is only, their sovereign debt ratio is just 28%. It's not very high. Sovereign debt to GDP, it's not very high. The Turkish government's, not the thing that's insolvent here. The problem is the Turkish companies, when looking to expand their businesses and went to the loan markets, they went to American banks and to European banks and bought loans in dollars, and they have to pay back in dollars, but they make their revenue in lira.
What's the reason why their debt is denominated in dollars?
Because you could borrow very cheaply, thanks to the benchmark rate coming from the Fed being essentially zero.
Years of quantitative easing.
So you think of it this way: you can go so if the benchmark rate in Turkey is 8 or 9%, the benchmark rate in the United States is 0.15%. Then you go to an American bank and they're willing to loan you, you're a Turkish concrete company and you're willing to, looking to get a loan, and you can get one in dollars at 3% or 4%, and you got to go into Turkish lira at 12%, right?
Right.
The benchmark rate plus 4. Well, that's huge. That cost of capital is enormous. What we balance sheet guys, or what MBAs will call your WACC, your weighted average cost of capital, is what determines your profitability of any entrepreneurial investment business expansion you're going to do. You decide what your WACC is, and then you figure out how you're going to achieve that. What's your maximum WACC you can handle, and how you have to either buy debt or sell equity, right? You can either sell stock to raise the capital, right, and you're going to sell stock at a certain percentage, and a certain percentage return to investors, expected return to investors, or you can buy debt. And you can do it that way, and that's what financial guys do. They just, that's what MBAs are trained to do, is to figure out what's the best way to expand the business. Do I sell equity or do I buy debt? And it's not a simple calculation, but it's something that any first year MBA student learns how to calculate quickly. And this is not to say that Turkish companies are acting stupidly or anything else. They're acting in a sense short-sightedly. But if the U.S. and Turkish relations are strong, because we've been NATO allies for the last 70 years, does anybody really think that there's going to be a problem between the Turkish lira and the U.S. dollar at some point? Well, yeah, there's going to be, if there's a shift in governmental attitude towards each other. If at some point Turkey decides it no longer wants to be the ally of the U.S. because the U.S. has stabbed it in the back 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 times.
And now there's a strong alliance that has formed really just in the past couple of years, the Russia, Iran, Syria.
China.
Yeah. So, as long as the relationship between Turkey, as you said, remains stable, and that means, I guess that translates generally to the currency ratio remaining somewhat stable. Therefore, your debts are predictable. Now, are these long-term debts? Because it seems to me that since 2015, and certainly since 2016, the Turkish corporations maybe should have seen some instability down the road. Although it's been a long relationship, they probably, they're still.
It's hard to de-dollarize. It's hard to change. The inertia is a very strong thing, right, in markets. What has been, what has been working is going to continue to work. Very few people are willing to really see very far ahead. It takes a contrarian mind to see this coming and then react accordingly. When your business is running well and your business is operating well, you're not thinking in terms of this change. And as Warren Buffett likes to say, I was working on a video right before we were doing this, and they ran by the quote from Buffett, which it's only when the tide goes out that we find out who's been swimming naked. And I'm not a huge Buffett fan, but he's always good for a bon mot here or there. And he's right. And this is where we are now. But it's not just the Turkish companies that are in trouble. It's the banks that lent them the money.
Yeah.
Because here's the gig, and it's an old aphorism in banking: when you owe the bank $1,000, it's your problem. When you owe the bank $222 billion, it's the bank's problem.
Yeah.
That's where we are now. And now we have to look at whose banks. So last Friday what, the 12th, not the 12th, the 11th or so, when I wrote the article about Turkish Lira problems are going to jump the Mediterranean or something like that, it was all about that, the set of headlines that were coming out that morning. I hadn't really been thinking about it. And I mean, I've been talking about it a lot. I've been saying this is coming. But when we hit that moment where the Financial Times is starting to name the banks that are in trouble, when everybody's on Wall Street and in the press is saying Turkey needs to ask the IMF for a bailout, they need to do this, they need to do that, I'm like, you're just talking your book. You're all swimming naked.
Yep.
You're all exposed here in a way that you're scared about. You've got $20 billion of this stuff or $10 billion of this stuff on your balance sheets. And I was reading the article at Zero Hedge, and it was like the 3 lines out of this huge article, and I went, oh, that's the whole story right there. And the story is BNP Paribas, the huge French bank, Unicredit, the huge Italian bank, and BBVA in Spain are all heavily exposed to Turkish corporate debt. They're the guy, and they're all zombies in the first place.
Yeah, they're already
kept alive because Mario Draghi, the head of the ECB, won't raise interest rates and continues to lop massive target 2 imbalances into the system and continues to just be the marginal buyer of all this garbage, Italian, French, Spanish, whatever debt. And that's the only thing keeping that system alive. And when you saw, and for me, as both a macro guy and a geopolitical analyst and a technical guy, so I can go in and look at the charts and go, oh, there's your breakdown signal, there's your this signal, there's your that signal. You can see it. So for weeks, I've been telling my subscribers and telling everyone, the euro breaking down below $1.15.5, $1.15.5.
What do you mean by breaking down?
Meaning that it's trading below that level, right? That breakdown is a chart
against the dollar,
right? Against the dollar. So the euro is now trading below a very significant support level at $1.15.
Gotcha.
It's trading at $1.13.8 when we went live this afternoon. And that was a big breakdown, and because it's like the 3rd or 4th time that it's hit that level in the last year, and it's always bounced off of it, so it's been managed back up. But once we hit that level on the Turkish Lira, having blown out from 5 to 5.5 to 7 overnight, right? The thing just went, it exploded 30% overnight. Now I got news for you. There are hundreds of billions of dollars of not just the debt, but the interest rate derivatives, because everybody who's hedged against this stuff, credit default swap contracts, ensuring as to whether or not this debt's going to be insure against the default of this debt. All these things, there's margin calls all over the world. Okay? It's not insignificant, which is why when you see the Financial Times going, they need to put capital controls on. They need to ask the IMF for a bailout. They need to do this. They need to do that. All that's them talking their book. That's all the banks and the oligarchy they're all going, you guys need to do all of this stuff, Turkey, that is. You guys need to do this, Erdogan. You need to knuckle under so that we don't go bankrupt, so that the IMF can bail us out through you.
Right.
The same way that when Greek debt went bad in 2015, do you think the Greek people saw $1 of that money? The Greek people weren't bailed out. This is why I get so angry with the Germans. That's why I get so angry with German politicians, because they sold the Greek bailout as some morally reprehensible, the morally bankrupt Greeks who borrowed too much money and then we have to bail them out, and then they still won't do what we asked them to do. I'm like, they're crushing these people into the dirt. They're doing exactly the same thing to Greece that the IMF did to Russia in 1997, 1998. It doesn't have to be like this. It's vile. And they want to put Turkey on that same path. And Erdogan very smartly is saying no.
I see that narrative showing through in like Bloomberg. They're already starting to, Turkey, they borrowed too much. It's a similar, I don't think they'll be able to pull off what they, the narrative that they pulled off with Greece, but I can already see some of it.
Well, they can pull that narrative off, but Erdogan's not listening. He's got Putin in his back pocket saying, look, this is how we did it in 2014. This is how we avoided the ruble crisis in 2014. Okay, there's already a blueprint for how to get out of this. And the people standing behind Turkey has friends, right? Greece didn't have any friends in 2015. They kind of asked the Russians for some help, but the Russians were in no position to ask them to help them. And if Greece wasn't willing to leave the euro, there was no way for the Russians to help them, right? So Turkey is not in that situation. They're not in the EU. They don't use the euro. They have their own currency. They can tell everybody to go scratch. And if the Russians and the Chinese need to come in and provide dollars through back doors, and I'm just going to make it simple. It's just they've got backdoor ways of funneling dollars into Turkey to deal with some of the debt, swap that debt out so that they pay it off in dollars and then reissue it and say Russian rubles or Chinese yuan or even local currency at low rates. This is what the Russians did. Now, give me a minute to explain what the Russians did, and then you'll understand how this works for Turkey. What the Russians did in late 2014 is they stopped defending the ruble as the ruble fell when oil prices fell. And everybody and their brothers sold the Russian ruble. During that fourth quarter of 2014, there was something like 50 or 60 billion dollars worth of Russian debt, corporate debt from Rosneft, Gazprom, a couple of others, that had to be rolled over.
And it was dollar denominated?
It was dollar denominated debt and with very low interest rates. And these guys were caught short when new sanctions were put on and the ruble collapsed. And what I mean by rolled over is they've got these bonds, right? And the bonds are maturing. So corporate debt, when the bond matures, the company has one of two options. It can pay back the money, the initial capital, right? So when you buy a corporate bond, you give some money to the company. They use that money for a certain amount of time and pay you a coupon payment.
Right.
Then 6% or whatever. And then at the end of the term of the bond, say it's 5 years, they pay you your money back, plus the 5% that they've been paying you a year for those 5 years. So all of this debt had to either be paid off, right, or rolled over. Meaning, hey, guys, current bondholders, we're going to just reissue the debt again, and you guys can get, and we'll pick up a new coupon payment. We'll adjust it for the new market, and maybe if we were paying you 5% before, maybe it'll be 5.5% now, right? Maybe it'll be 4.5%, but whatever the market is, and that the bond gets rolled over. Well, the Russians, with the new sanctions that were put on in 2014, were barred from doing that in dollars. They weren't allowed to. They were shut out of U.S. banks and European banks, and were not allowed to transact in dollars in those banks at all. And therefore, they couldn't roll the debt over. They had to pay it off. So now all of a sudden, the Russians were staring at a $60 billion bill. So the first thing they did was they stopped defending the ruble by selling their foreign exchange reserves and depleting their national savings account. Because foreign exchange reserves, just think of it like a savings account. The currency is getting crushed. If they want to maintain the exchange rate, which at the time the Russian ruble was trading at around 30, 32 or so, and it started to rise, the Russian central bank could sell the dollars that they're sitting on in order to, and buy rubles and sell dollars in order to keep the exchange rate.
So basically, they're just trying to keep the demand for their own currency.
Right. They're trying to keep the demand for their own currency up. Eventually, they just stopped doing that, and they let the ruble rise tremendously. No one expected this. Everybody expected Putin to continue to dig in, and he said, no, let it rise. Let it do what it's going to do. And eventually, the Russian ruble hit a peak of around 80. Okay? Just shy of 80. That was the first thing he did. The second thing he did, which was not particularly, which was a long-term thing, was to institute a new economics package, which would, he hates to use the word liberalize, but liberalize the economy. So remove a lot of permitting barriers and whatnot in order to in order to jumpstart new business formation and internal capital formation within the country. That was the second thing. It was a very minor point, but it set Russia up for a long term. That sets it up well for the long term by removing some of the Soviet era regulations and permitting and graft and everything else that's in there. That was still baked into the Russian economy. The third thing that happened that ultimately stabilized the ruble and the Russian stock exchange was the announcement of yuan ruble swap lines between Russia and China. And what that did was it gave the Chinese the ability to backdoor dollars into the Russian economy through their bilateral trade, changing rubles and yuan. And literally, if you look at a chart of the Russian MISEX stock exchange, you will see that the day that was announced was the bottom of the Russian stock market. When that announcement hit, the Russian stock market jumped 200 points or so. And from then on, it's been in a bull market ever since. And that's when I actually, literally, when I told my subscribers to buy the Russian stock market on that day, because I understood that at that moment, that was the maximum moment of pain.
What happened to the $60 billion
they paid it off?
Russian corporate.
So what they did, they paid most of it off, and they swapped a lot of it out in rubles.
They paid it off because China helped them have enough dollars to do that?
Well, they had, they had enough dollars to do it. They may not have had $60 billion sitting on their reserves, so they needed another way to get dollars into the country. The Chinese helped them with that. The Russians then, the Russian central bank did what it was supposed to do. If the central bank is supposed to exist, and you know that I'm an Austrian economist, I don't believe in central banking, but if you have to deal with the evil of central banking and debt-based currency and all this other rotten nonsense, which is actually the root of all of this evil, then the central bank is designed that during a liquidity crisis, when there's a moment where there's not enough currency to just deal with the problem in the short term, right? And this is all just a short-term funding problem, right? That the central bank is supposed to come in, buy up the bad corporate paper, deal with the problem, and reliquify the system and get that off the books, off the company's books in the short term, and then they can sell it off later when the acute crisis is over. And that's what the Russian central bank did. So they reissued those bonds in rubles to pay off like Russian investors and whatnot. And then everybody else who needed to just be paid off, the foreign investors, they got paid off in dollars. And those bonds were paid down, and these companies didn't have that debt on their books anymore. It was painful, it was difficult, but because the Russians had $500 billion in foreign exchange reserves, they could do this. They have a low debt to GDP ratio. The entire debt of Russia at that moment in time, I mean, private, financial, public, all of it was less than their foreign exchange reserves. And so the Russians, having run a very tight ship for a long time under Putin, I'd almost say very Austrian-like, as close to a country running an economy like an Austrian economist would. They were in a position to do that. Now, Turkey's not in the same position that the Russians are. They're going to need more help. They're going to need someone to help bail them out.
But you think that given Erdogan's alliance with Russia, Iran, China, you think that maybe, I don't know, you could say maybe Putin's acting as his investment advisor, are going to help him use the same formula or a similar formula to help Turkey fight back?
I think that's exactly what's happening. It's what I said to the woman on Sputnik yesterday, and she was a little speechless once I got finished saying this, and you can hear it in the part of the interview that they released. You can hear her say, "Look, if you're Putin and you want to cleave Turkey from NATO, and you want them to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you want them to join the BRICS, and you want all of this stuff to happen, and you want the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative to unify Central Asia. Now we've got the 5 Caspian Sea countries. All of a sudden, they've got an agreement to utilize the Caspian Sea now, right? This is 20 years, 25 years, they couldn't come up with an agreement. Now in a week, boom, it happens. Comes together quick. Why is that? If you're Putin and you're Xi Jinping in China, how much is it worth to you to just throw some money down a rabbit hole like Turkey to pay off some corporate debt of the companies that are going to build your nuclear power plants? So they're going to build Turk Stream pipeline, that are going to ensure that the Turkish economy doesn't completely implode. The farms, the concrete companies, the pipeline companies, the electricity providers, whatever corporate debt needs to be paid off. if you've got some dollars, do it. The Russians just sold most of their U.S. Treasury bonds in April and May. You've seen that, right? You saw that, right?
Yeah, and why did they do it?
Why did they do it? No, they said because they've been saying because while the United States dollar is becoming an unreliable trade settlement currency. That's Diplo speak for if we don't do exactly what you tell us to do, you cut us off from your markets. So that's one. Two, they didn't think that they didn't see this coming. You don't think that they saw this plus Iran's problems coming? Because President Trump has been like a bull in a china shop, telling everybody what he's going to do, and then goes and does it. And then when they say no, and when he puts sanctions on people and says, if you don't stop doing trade with Iran, we're going to do this to you. And anybody who says, well, we're going to still trade with Iran, then he doubles the sanctions on them. Then he doubles this. He keeps doubling down over and over again. They're just sitting there going, okay, fine. We've got savings. The Chinese have got $3 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves. The Russians have got $500 billion. And the problems of countries like Turkey and Iran are much smaller than that, those piles of cash. So the Russians selling most of their treasury bonds, they're sitting on a big pile of dollars. Because when you sell treasury bonds, you get dollars for them.
Right.
So now they're sitting on this. Now, the official numbers were like $85 billion. There was an article on Zero Hedge yesterday where a guy from the Council on Foreign Relations did a big forensic deep dive on what was happening. And his conclusion was that they probably sold about $45 billion, and the other $40 billion are sitting in Euroclear in Belgium and Cayman Islands offshore accounts. And I'm thinking to myself, that's even worse, because that means the Russians haven't actually sold all their treasuries yet. They've got another 40 billion sitting in much more liquid positions in Euroclear in Brussels and the Cayman Islands, where they can sell them easily, as opposed to if they're still in Russia, having to get around all the sanctions and the rules and everything else. They sold everything before the worst of the financial sanctions came into effect. Now they're sitting with the position to be able to sell them.
So they're ready to react at the drop.
They can react at a moment's notice if they need to. And we're not going to know any of this as to what happens here in reality until well after. And we're only going to know this in hindsight. So by September or October, we're going to be able to piece together what happened. We'll get the TIC reports from the Treasury Department. We'll get these numbers. Will come out eventually. But you can still see it in the charts. You can still see it in the way the financial markets trade. If the Turkish Lira doesn't break down beyond where it hit on Friday, if it starts to strengthen from here, and we get and this is where my technical experience comes in. If we get a weekly bearish reversal on the Turkish Lira this week, that's a good signal that we may get a monthly bearish reversal by the end of August. And then once we get a monthly bearish reversal, the trend is changing. I'm looking for like a trend change. And right now we've got Turkey moving into hyperinflation. This may be the worst of it. It may not. We may still see it go to 9 or 10. Okay, fine. But eventually, at some point, we're going to hit that max pain moment. And look, don't get me wrong. The Russians and the Chinese will bail Turkey out, but they're going to do it for their maximum benefit. They're going to wait until the last possible moment to do it. And it's also going to cause the maximal amount of pain for the European Union and the United States.
Now, here's one thing I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
I'm always wondering why now? Like timing is a big thing with me.
Yeah.
And so I just listed out some things that, might be part of the picture here. And I wonder, as you said before, this crisis in Turkey is also a potential EU crisis, right? Because it's the EU banks that are have the most exposure. And it just so happens that the Iran sanctions battle is going on between the U.S. and the EU. The EU is supposedly standing firm and pushing back and saying, hell no, we're not going to stop doing business with Iran. And, Trump has made it pretty clear that he's not happy with the EU. Now, is that related? Could this be an indirect way of pressuring the EU?
Well, it absolutely is. And part of me, it's funny. Trump is a very mercurial figure. And I know you've heard me talk about this in my live streams, and we've kind of game planned weird scenarios on this. And I don't have a definitive answer as to what I think is going on with Donald Trump. I wish I did, but I don't. All I can do with Donald Trump is like throw up probability clouds, right? This might be, this has got like a 65% chance of being right. This has got about 30% chance of being right, and that's just freaking stupid. That's not what's going on here. There's a very distinct possibility that what Trump is trying to do, and I've said this in print, that the pressure on Iran is really pressure on Germany. That he's forcing a crisis moment for everybody. That Iran, the problems between the United States and Iran are solvable. They're not that hard to solve. There's not really any overlap between the economies. We have no real problem with each other at a fundamental level, right? There's no ideal. I mean, it's not even like ideology or anything. This has more to do with ideological inertia trapped within the Washington apparatus in the same way that we're dealing with the ideological inertia trapped within the Washington apparatus when it comes to Russia, right? There's a lot of just old guard, Cold Warrior thinking all through that generation of politicians and think tank members and everything else.
The blob, as Obama called them, the blob.
Sure. You can call them whatever you want. I tend to call them feckless boomers, but that's just me. And I don't use the term boomer like an alt-right guy or anything. I'm just they're baby boomers, and they have all their biases of that era, that generation. And Trump is a very typical baby boomer in his view of the world, and that happens to color his thinking, and it is what it is. And he's unfortunately surrounded, or has surrounded himself. You choose what that is. People who have this mentality, and Washington is littered with it. And it's that inertia is not going to change anytime soon. So, I don't believe for a moment that John Bolton's been tamed. I don't believe for a moment that Bill Kristol's not a very, very significant player behind the scenes. Him and Sheldon Adelson putting pressure on Trump to do X, Y, and Z. Alistair Crook had a great article the other day on strategic culture, talking about the religious significance of various aspects of the Jewish faith and how that pertains to Israel, and whether or not the Orthodox Judaism of Jared Kushner is affecting, and Ivanka Trump is affecting all of this. I don't know at this point. I'm just bringing it all up there for us to discuss and for us to think about. But I do know that Trump hates the EU with a purple passion, that his fundamental instincts are that he sees the EU as a tyrannical thing, in the same way that he sees a lot of the swamp in Washington as a tyrannical thing. His instincts tell him that, okay? He also thinks that Iran's theocracy is a tyrannical thing and needs to be dealt with, right? So he's not a particularly deep creature.
Right, not sophisticated, yeah.
Really not that sophisticated. He's somewhere between the buffoon that the left wants to think him being, or his opposition wants him to believe that he is, and the 4D chess master that the MAGA pedes want to believe in. I'm sitting there firmly in the middle going, no, he's just this guy who's got really preternaturally good instincts on how to deal with media. He's got good instincts on foreign policy, but he's trapped in a policy inertia environment that doesn't allow him a lot of leeway and a lot of room.
And he's a New Yorker with some street smarts, right?
Right. Yeah. And he's worked with corrupt people his entire life. You can't get a building built in New York if you're not paying people off behind the scenes and all this stuff.
Exactly.
It's all petty stuff. Come on. It's
or casinos in Atlantic City.
Right. Casinos in Atlantic City. If you don't think that you don't have to pay off the concrete union rep with envelopes of cash, it's like, how naive are you? And you think that that's criminal behavior? I got news for you. If you've visited those buildings, if you've worked at a fast food joint that is supported by that building, I got news for you. You're as corrupt as Trump is. At the end of the day, because that's what it comes down to. So that's not the problem here, right? That level of corruption is just petty. It's endemic to the society. It's endemic to the system, the environment that he grew up in. But at the same time, I think that I think he believes that there's a deal to be worked out with Iran, right? What he's most worried about is the ballistic missiles. He's not worried about the nuclear warheads. He understands fundamentally that North Korea was working on the nuclear warhead, Iran was working on the ballistic missile, and the two of them were technology sharing. It's kind of mutual outsourcing, as I like to call it. And what he's most worried about and rightly so, or at least his benefactors are worried about, is the Iran having ballistic missiles that can wipe out Saudi Arabia and Israel, and that's what he's worried about. But at the same time, the Israelis don't want to even admit to the fact that they have over 2,000 or 200 nukes or whatever the hell they have, and and the Saudis, and now they're giving the Saudis nuclear weapons technology. These are the most unreliable people on the planet. These are
what could go wrong?
Yeah, what could go wrong here, right? So, and Trump needs the Saudis in the short term to keep the petrodollar from going the way of the dodo until we're producing 15 million barrels of oil a day. Because I think that's his strategy, is to open up all the drilling in all these major areas that we have not just the shale oil stuff. What I'm talking about, I'm talking about the real oil production. Anwar, the real oil under the Permian Basin, the real oil. I mean, there's so much deep oil in the United States that we haven't tapped. It's not funny, right? And I think that that's his ultimate goal, is to maintain the empire through energy dominance while deprecating the military.
Are you saying where our own oil production could prop up the petrodollar rather than needing the Middle Eastern oil?
Saudis to do it for us, right?
Well, the Saudis are not in good shape.
No, they're in terrible shape. And I think that this relationship with the United States is a toxic one. We're obviously extracting maximum usage out of them. The Saudis still think that because they're rich and they can buy people off, that they can continue to run the narrative that they're the good guys in the Middle East, and they're not. And everybody doesn't believe that anymore. Nobody believes that anymore.
No.
And it's going to be the generational changing of the guard of the legislature in the United States that will ultimately break this stalemate. And unfortunately, I don't see a lot of this changing anytime soon. I don't think the midterm elections. I don't think the midterm elections are they're going to give Trump, I think, a real majority in the Senate. But because the committeeships and chairmanships are all still stabbed by horrible people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Dianne Feinstein and the rest, I don't see Ben Cardin and all of them. I don't see that part of the calculus is going to change. Not until the party leadership fundamentally changes, and I don't see that. I see another election cycle before we get that.
Speaking of Lindsey Graham, the reason why I listen to Lindsey Graham is that he gives away, he just gets and starts rambling, and he gives away the war party strategy, and goals, So what he said recently was, and he just added this on to a list of things that Trump needed to do when he went to Russia, or when he talked to Putin. He's going on, like this and that and the other thing. And at the end of it, he just tacks on, he says, and Turkey needs to come back, our relations with Turkey need to go back to normal. As if that was going to be a somewhat trivial thing, as if sort of a tectonic shift hadn't happened over the past few years.
Right.
Yeah. I assume that's what's driving this economic war on do you agree that we are waging economic war in Turkey right now?
Absolutely. I think this is absolutely, I think it's, look, it's like everything else. The situation presented itself, right? Right. The Turks' large current account deficit, their huge corporate indebtedness and dollars and everything else, all of that laid the opportunity at our feet to then just push.
Did some specific thing just happen in the past week, though, that brought this opportunity to a head?
No, I just think that, you throw a couple $2 billion at the currency markets, and then once the margin calls start, everything takes care of itself from there. It's not that hard. And everybody knows it. That's when you throw a couple $1 billion at a particular market and you want to bomb it, and everybody's positioned in a particular way, all you have to do is break that stalemate, and you can push the market. Because one of the things about when you learn about markets is that concepts like support and resistance on a stock price are very real, because what they do is they define the last point at which the supply of buyers or sellers overwhelm the other one. So when the stock is rising and you hit a high, that's when the supply of sellers overwhelms the supply of buyers, and then they get pushed down. So there's a lot of activity at that price, and that becomes resistance that has to be overcome, because the people who bought at the top are going to be the first ones to sell when we get back to that price, to try and, because they've been holding losses and now they just want to get out. And same thing happens on the bottom. When you get down to a bottom, it's going to be when the supply of buyers finally go, woo, bargains. And then everybody jumps in with both fists and overwhelms the supply of sellers. And then those who push the trade too far, then they're caught net short, and then they become, then they have to cover their shorts, and then the thing goes back in the other direction. And we have volatility for a while until it all dampens down. The currency markets are leveraged anywhere from 100 to 1,000 to 1. You want to go trading Forex, you can take $100 and you can go command, with margin call, with very, very thin margins, you could command $10,000 or $100,000 worth of currency. Okay. But if you bet right, you can make huge money in the short term, right? If you bet right. And what that means is, with that amount of leverage, that means that once you push through a support or resistance line, that everybody's covering those positions because their equity positions are eroding really quickly, because what leverage giveth on the way up takes away twice as fast on the way down. Okay. And if you've never had a margin call in your life, it sucks.
Yeah, I haven't.
It hadn't happened to me, and it's terrible. It happened to me a long time ago. I don't trade like that anymore. And I don't really trade anymore at all because I don't have the right temperament for it. So, and this is not why I also don't talk about trading in my newsletter. I have a long-term portfolio strategy based on big geopolitical trends, because that matches my thinking, and so it matches the advice that I give people who are paying me for my advice and for my insight, right? Otherwise, but I can analyze in the short term what's happening in the market, but I can't act on it. It's a very weird place to be. But it's very valuable because it allows you to describe what's happening so that you can impart and teach people and give them knowledge, but it's knowledge that you can't fundamentally act on, right? Other than to teach people, and then hopefully they'll pay you, and that's how you profit.
The emotion of having money on the line doesn't, cloud your thinking or screw it up.
Yeah, and you just stay, and when you stay out of it, you just kind of look at it and go, oh, there's the chart, there's the breakdown, there's the thing, this is what you want to do, and then here's a strategy, and here's a potential strategy for you. If someone asks, right, I have a subscriber ask, this is what I do, and I'll just give them a quick breakdown of what I think is happening, and then usually, a recommendation on a trade, and they can decide what they want to do with it one way or the other.
Right.
Because I think that's just the best way of going about it. So.
What else I was wondering? Well, pretty much whenever anything happens right now, you have to ask, is it related to the 2018 election? Because, just because of the way things are here, it's silly season on steroids, if you will. So is there a possibility that creating chaos that would hurt Trump is something that the big brokers in the finance industry could be doing, a pre-election chaos kind of thing? Or is that, I think it's a long shot, but.
I do too, and I'll tell you why. Because the markets aren't set up for the United States assets not to be the benefactor of any chaos at this point. All the emerging markets are exposed. Europe is exposed. Japan is exposed. We've seen jitters in every one of these markets in the last couple of weeks, right? Since Turkey blew up, the South African rand crushed. Brazilian real, the Argentinian peso, both got crushed the other day, okay, on Monday. We're recording this on Tuesday, so that was yesterday. So you have Japan, a developed market, 3 times in a week and a half. The Bank of Japan had to intervene into the 10-year Treasury bond market, their 10-year Treasury bond market, which they've been doing forever, but intervene hard to keep the rates from rising too far, from their bonds being sold too far too fast, beyond their limit, right? They have a limit. The Bank of Japan has a yield targeting strategy where they say, well, we want the 10-year to trade no higher than 0.1%. And if it rises above that, then we're going to be an unlimited buyer. They had to actually raise that range to that limit to 0.2 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago. Now, here's a question for you. Do you think that might have had something to do with the turmoil in China, the turmoil in Turkey, the turmoil in Italy, all these other things? Because all of these markets are interconnected.
Yeah.
And, a small bankruptcy in a bank in Italy can have far-reaching effects on a bank in Japan once it gets played through all the players and how they've laid off their risk through hedging, while how they've, it is, all of this stuff is so complicated. No regulator in hell has a prayer of understanding it all. The banks themselves don't even understand their books at this point. And the central banks, all they do is provide liquidity to keep everybody solvent. And everybody looks at that going, oh, cool. Central banks will always come in to bail us out. They keep doing the same thing that they shouldn't be doing. Why?
But they're first responders, not so much
Yeah.
schemers or planners,
Right.
if you will. I guess they should be. But
yeah, though absolutely they should be. But the truth of the matter is that nobody gets out beforehand, because why should you? When the trade is still profitable, you're going to stay in it. And very few people are willing to get out of a trade early. And the other thing is that inertia is real, and that complacency in markets is real.
yeah, like nobody really thinks that Turkey would leave NATO. There's, the threat and the relations between NATO and Turkey have been, and, between the EU and Turkey, between the US and Turkey, have been, really rocky for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody thinks that Erdogan's actually going to do that. I mean, I still,
don't want to believe
I tend to think he's not going to go for the IMF bailout, but leaving NATO is another thing altogether.
Have an option. The U.S. is putting him in a position: you either accept our terms of surrender or you leave. And he's gone. And if the Russians and the Chinese come in with big piles of cash to bail out the worst of the companies that are in trouble, banks or whatever, they're in trouble. I got news for you. That shift will happen quickly. Erdogan came out and said right after the BRICS summit, I want to become part of the BRICS. A week later, the Turkish Lira has gone from 4.5 to 7. Timing?
Yeah.
Yes, of course. I think he's pushing this on purpose. To be honestly, Joanne, I wrote a piece. I said, I think this is honestly an invited crisis. Like, what better way than to take the U.S. at their word and take Trump at his word, than to invite the crisis and think, okay, and again, so you think you're going to take us down? Fine, we're taking everybody with you.
Well, that is very peak Erdogan. I mean, that's exactly what he did with the refugee crisis. He just said, don't give me what I want, or don't do what I want, and I'm going to send waves of refugees over to EU. I mean, he wasn't even doing it in secret anymore. He was saying that in public.
Oh yeah, no, and he's openly accusing the U.S. of trying to overthrow him now, of staging a coup against him. He's openly defying. I mean, this is serious now. He's not screwing around here. And the guys on Wall Street are saying, well, the banks will get their hair mussed, but everything will be fine. And I'm literally thinking to myself, like, it's like the scene from Dr. Strangelove when they're talking about how many people are going to die, and there's George C. Scott saying, well, 10 to 20 million dead tops. Nah, no more than that. It's like, yeah, I'm not saying we won't get our hair mussed, but come on, we'll win. And I'm like, it's that mania of thinking what has been, what will be. And all I ever keep saying to people is, how did you go broke? Slowly and then all at once. How did the markets break down? They break down slowly and then all at once. And this is what's happening with the Turkish Lira. And this is what's going to start to happen with Europe. It's going to start to happen with Japan after that. And everybody will be going, wouldn't see it coming, because they can't see the mechanism by which to get out of it. And they don't want to spook anybody. So they always say, well, it's bad, but it's not that bad. The central banks can handle this because Turkey's not that big a deal. So really? Turkey's not that big a deal? Then there's Brazil, then there's Argentina, then there's Thailand, then there's this one, then there's that one. They all start to go. Now what?
This is also the way that the Syrian war was reported, the official narrative, if you will. Mm-hmm. If you have the majority of people believing that narrative, then they really don't understand these underlying things that were really happening. And that's going to make them less informed for economic, financial decisions.
Yes.
So
the guys on Wall Street believe what they're told by reading. They read the Wall Street Journal. They read Bloomberg. They read this one. They read Reuters. They don't read alternative news sources. This is why even sites like Zero Hedge, which at times is absolutely ideologically all over the map, because there's 50 guys that write for Zero Hedge. There's how many Tylers are there? 47 or whatever. And some of them hate Erdogan, and other ones are looking at him going, no, he's brilliant. And you can just see it. You're like, okay, so that's the lefty Tyler, and that's the hardcore righty Tyler, and that's this Tyler. And but even those guys, there comes a point where everybody's got their bias and their blinders, and staying even remotely neutral and I'm not neutral. I'm not going to say that I am. But you do try, right? You do try to spin scenarios that could be plausible, and then you run them through, And then you ask yourself the question, okay, so what's the probability of that scenario being the correct one? Betting on the U.S. being overly aggressive towards its partners is a pretty safe bet.
It's a good bet, yeah.
Good bet. It always has been. So hard for me to argue. Us trying to do Max Payne against the Russians, it's a pretty good bet.
Yep.
So hard to argue with that, from that perspective. It's, when you understand, and then when you understand the men involved, and you understand their motivations, and you understand how they act, and you start getting into the men themselves and their shortcomings and their strengths and their weaknesses, then really everything becomes almost easy to handicap what's happening next. Not maybe the timing of those things, but certainly the general trends.
Well, the other thing is that, at least for the past several years, and I don't know the history that well, probably for decades before, the U.S. and Turkey has gotten into some pretty big dust-ups, but it always gets smoothed over. It's unthinkable that it wouldn't get smoothed over. We also have, an incredibly important military asset there, the Incirlik Air Base. And I think a whole lot of other bases too. And that's, from what I know, that is really, really important to the military brass. And so if they can, exercise their influence on this, they're going to. Yeah,
and they will. And that's the interesting part about this, right? And the Turks are not backing down. I saw a thing that some Turkish lawyers want to question various American military for their involvement in the coup attempt.
I saw that. What?
And I'm like, they're not screwing around here. This is serious. And it's like, I don't understand how anybody can think that this isn't, again, but complacency and apathy and inertia are huge. People will always talk themselves out of, oh, well, cooler heads always prevail. Well, yeah, when it comes to nuclear weapons, yes. And everything else, no. When it's a potential nuclear conflict, yeah, cooler heads always prevail. But when it comes to everything else, they're always, the guys who are saying cooler heads will prevail are almost invariably wrong, because it may not get to a crisis point in this particular instance of conflict, but that is never going to be forgotten. And at some point, there's going to be a structural break. And we're already there with the Russians. That's very obvious. The Chinese China's the big wild card here. They've got a lot of internal problems that the rising dollar is beginning to affect them with as well. And I think that they have their way out of it. Certainly, I don't think that China catches a cold and the United States doesn't get a cough. I think everybody hurts if the Chinese economy really starts to contract, because their shadow banking bubble begins to burst, which it's bursting. This is just another version of it bursting, and I don't think we want to go into that today. That's a good 20-minute discussion on its own. Yeah. But just to say that China's got debt issues of its own, corporate debt issues of its own internally, and that those things are going to have to be dealt with. And I know that part of the full court press here on Turkey, Russia, China, everybody all at the same time is to try and keep everybody from reacting to each other's pain, right? To paralyze China by attacking them on tariffs, and to paralyze the Russians by not allowing them to move capital around the world, so they can isolate Turkey and they can isolate Iran. I think that's what's going on here. So when you start to think start thinking tactically and strategically, right? Think like a military guy, right? And know that we war game all of this stuff. No, we know that. I don't know if anybody's. I can't remember if you asked me recently or somebody else did, but Jim Rickards talks about this stuff all the time, because he sits in on the war games with the CIA and the DoD, figuring out how they're going to, what's their plan of attack for dealing with this problem or that problem. We know they do it. And they're smart guys. They're not stupid. I don't think anybody in this situation is stupid. Anybody who thinks Erdogan is stupid is a moron. No one is in power for as long, or as consolidated power like he has for as long as he has, is stupid. No way. Just like Trump. No one gets elected in the United States as president is not a smart guy. I mean, again, Trump is a complicated figure, and so is Erdogan. But we understand Erdogan's. But I think the one thing we can bet on here is that he's done with the United States. I don't think he's suing for peace here. I think he's going to the mat, and I think that you save a man's life, like Putin saved his life, and then in every way has doors been opened to Turkey as a major broker of peace in the Middle East with the Astana process, with Turkey being involved in the talks in Afghanistan as well, with Turkey being brought into the Russian energy sphere. And because Turkey is a major energy importer, this is part of their biggest problem. So getting gas from Gazprom, getting nuclear power from Rosatom, right? These are big deals for Turkey. This is big stuff. And those things were all put on the table even after Erdogan was framed for shooting down a Russian pilot.
That's a really big deal. The prediction that, and I can see all the signs there. I don't disagree with you, although I'm still not willing to go quite that far. I don't know if he's really going to do it, but I mean, it sure looks that way. Sure. So the other thing about Erdogan is that he's obsessed with weeding out, his purge. Right. After the coup attempt, there were a lot of, I don't know what I guess he calls them veto, or people he feels are disloyal to Turkey. Right. And are loyal to NATO and the West. And he's been obsessed with weeding them out of his military now, and also the civilian, schools and, police force, other institutions. And he seems to be approaching the corporations who are in debt right now, or basically all of his businesses. As you pointed out, I hadn't seen it that way before. He's basically going to call on them and say, where's your loyalty? Who are you loyal to?
Yep.
That's a major point. Yeah.
I think it is. And it's something, again, as I was writing that article, and sometimes when you're doing this stuff, I'm so immersed in it. As I was writing that article, these things just spill out. And the part about Erdogan looking for finding out who's going to be loyal to Turkey and who isn't, in terms of the corporations, of course, it just makes strategic and tactical sense. If that's the situation, then this is their situation. Then we're going to find out, who loves you, baby, and we just move on from there, and then just move through and it's just a natural progression of thought, because when you put yourself in the shoes of the man that you're trying to analyze, it becomes really obvious. And I hate to spend my days putting myself in the shoes and Recep Erdogan, but it's what you got to do in order to be really good at this business. And it's the business I've chosen, so I don't have anybody to blame except myself. So
all right, well, I think I've kept you too long already over time, so we should probably wrap this up. Why don't you let everybody know where to find your work?
Sure. You can find my work over at goldgoatsandguns.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at TFL1728. You can follow my work over at Steemit as well. It's Steemit/goldgoatsandguns. And you can follow me on YouTube as well. Just look up Tom Luongo or Gold Goats and Guns. You'll find me.
That's great. Hey, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk with you again.
Thank you, Joanne. I appreciate the invite, as always.
Okay. Have a good one.
You too, babe.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening, and a special thanks to Tom Luongo. You can follow Tom on Twitter at TFAsInFrankL1728. Find his work at Gold Goats and Gun blog. That's at tomluongo.me. Also on Steemit, and find his videos on YouTube. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media, and it's brought to you with the help of our generous donors. You can pitch in by going to patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or you can do one-time donations on our website, aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire. Subscribe to the Around the Empire podcast on iTunes, iHeartRadio, and other podcast apps. And if you like it, leave a nice review. It helps. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and it helps a lot there if you hit the subscribe button for the channel, and also use the thumbs up icon to like the individual videos. And lastly, please like our page on Facebook. Hope everybody's enjoying these last weeks of summer, or winter if you are in a different hemisphere than me, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.